All right. So now we speak to the investors in response. Today we have Chinelo Anohu, the head and senior director of the Africa Investment Forum, Marcelo Claure, chairman and CEO of Claure Capital, and Nelson Peltz, founder of Trian Fund Management. So for the three of you, I want to ask, what is your highest priority and why? We'll start with you.
Well, thank you very much, everyone, and it's really an honor to be here. I'm talking for the 55 nations in the African continent. And for us, the priority remains tackling what is uppermost in the world at the moment, food security. How do we feed ourselves? How do we help feed the rest of the world? And that's where we're channeling a lot of investments. We're, of course, talking about infrastructure and the need to make it available across the continent. And also the fact that in Africa, most of the infrastructure needed hasn't been done. It presents a key opportunity to do it right, so that we do it in a manner that is sustainable, clean, and renewable resources attached to it. We're also very clearly focusing on the youth, which is one of our biggest assets. And these youths come up in the comparative advantage Africa has in not just the entertainment industry, the creative industry, and also very clearly the technology part of it. Because a lot of the markets we're talking about, we have the Africa Free Trade Agreement coming up, a lot of it will be dependent on the technology. We have the healthcare, which is necessary, and we find that the healthcare investments are fueled by the kind of technology to make it accessible even in the remotest areas. And the Africa Investment Forum is a multidisciplinary, multi-stakeholder platform initiated by the African Development Bank with 7 other partners. And the goal is to accelerate investments in the continent, assist in raising capital, but most importantly, assist in project preparations that will make the deals bankable to attract the capital needed. And we also unlock bottlenecks, provide unlimited intelligence to facilitate the deals, so that the priority sectors, not just by mobilizing domestic finance, but making it possible to make everyone who is in this room, who is thinking of Africa or not thinking of Africa, find a sustainable pathway. Thank you.
Thank you. So, as I was thinking, my biggest priorities, I've been blessed to be able to have a significant amount of opportunities in my life. And I think there's an incredible amount of people who have an incredible amount of talent, but they don't have an opportunity. And an area where I am passionate of fixing is the lack of connectivity and the lack of devices that kids have in order for them to go and finish school. And I want to make sure that I was one of the founders of One Laptop Per Child, where we gave away millions of laptops to kids. And recently in the US, it's hard to believe that in a country like the US, who's a powerhouse, there's 10 million kids who don't have access to the internet, and therefore they're failing in school. So my priority is to make sure we can connect every kid in the world by providing them connectivity and providing them a device for a very simple reason. We all talk about technology, but if you're not connected, you don't have access to technology. And I'm a huge believer that if you're able to connect every kid and we give them access to technology, they're going to be able to build their own future.
Thank you. It's nice to be here. Thank you for having me. Look, I've got 10 kids, and some of them are pretty young, even for an old guy like me.
10 yours?
They're all mine, and I wish they weren't on I wish they could get off the internet sometime. I'd like to leave them a better, safer, cleaner world. And I think we're going in the wrong direction on many of those. We've got today a rampant inflation. We've got a war in Europe that hopefully will not spread. And we have in this country, which I still think is the greatest country on earth, we've got a political system and we've got politicians that don't speak to one another. They don't work together. They're myopic. They can't see more than 8 feet. When they see 8 feet, they see a guy from another, or a woman from another party, and that's their enemy. The enemy is across any ocean that you can, Atlantic, Pacific, you cross that, you can find an enemy, but it's not the man or woman across the aisle. Those people need to work together. If you look at this country, in the early 80s, we had Reagan, a conservative Republican president. You had Tip O'Neill, Speaker of the House, a pretty left-wing Democrat. They were good friends. They worked together for the betterment of our country and therefore the betterment of the world. I think that's the kind of thing we've got to be able to bring back. So those are my issues. I worry about inflation. I worry about the other things, but the safety and the direction we're going in are things that I find very disturbing.
So you touched on this a bit, but I'd like to see if you can go into it a bit deeper. Which new technologies in particular and industries will investors be prioritizing over the next decade?
Well, for the continent, it's, like you've mentioned, connectivity. If you look at the size of the continent, it's a no-brainer that any investment that allows people to connect to the internet, to have the access that they need. We were talking about the pandemic and how everybody had to work from home. And you'd be in a conference and you could tell exactly where the person is connecting from by the quality of the connection. And you had all those frozen faces sometimes because there was a power outage or the cables weren't just fast enough to carry the data. So for me, that is very key. And again, in Africa as a continent, we're lucky to be blessed with talent above the soil, that's in humans, and below, in minerals. So a lot of the energy that is going on now, we have electric cars coming up for a cleaner. They need the materials to power them, and that you find them in lithium. And we find a lot of these are investments and projects we have on our platform now that we see will take a huge stake in the future. And of course, manufacturing on the continent. All of this require a commensurate amount of investment in technology, because without it, you'll just be moving at a slow pace that will not be useful for adequate growth.
You mentioned opportunities, and you mentioned your efforts with giving laptops to children. It's such a big task, how do you target how much you can help and how many people you can actually give opportunities to?
I mean, you have to have ambitious goals, right? And in the US, we set up a goal to eliminate every single kid that shouldn't have, every kid should have access to the internet, because it's a really bad problem. You have these kids who go to school, and then they're given homework to be completed via the internet. They go home, they don't have internet, they go outside of McDonald's. In no time, girls end up being prostitutes, boys end up being drug dealers, and therefore some lives goes to waste. So therefore, the ambition was always, let's get rid of this problem. And what we did is, at Sprint, when I was the CEO of Sprint, the prior job, we launched what was called a 1 million project. And it was great to solve 1 million, but there were other 9 million kids that didn't have access. And then we did a very successful merger with T-Mobile that has created the world's most valuable telecommunications company. And as part of the merger, we basically made a commitment that we were going to go from 1 to 10. And hard to believe that in a country like the US, in the next year or two, we're actually eliminated what is called the homework gap. And therefore, every kid is going to have access to the internet. And the ones that can afford it, you get it for free. But it all started with the dream. And obviously, the US, you wouldn't expect to see this in the US. So now what we're doing is we're talking to other telcos all around the world, because a telco, we've already paid for the infrastructure, so it doesn't cost anything. It's marginal cost to provide free connectivity to people that needs it. And soon there's going to be other telcos following what we've done. And my goal is, every kid, if we actually want to change the world, and we want to make sure that we get rid of poverty, to me, the bare, bare minimum is kids should have access to the internet. And if you have access to the internet, you have access to technology. And again, like I said, I believe technology is the biggest enabler of progress, but we cannot have progress if we don't meet the basics.
So we've got access to connectivity, we've got emerging technologies. What you are mentioning is kind of an age-old problem in terms of polarization. How do investors actually solve that? Can they, if this is your highest priority?
I'm sorry, I didn't hear your whole question.
So you mentioned that your highest priority is kind of ending this political polarization as
Right,
one of
okay.
your issues. So how can investors actually contribute to ending that problem?
That's a very good question. I hope you have a better answer than I do.
There's the
Okay?
reason I'm the
Let me
journalist
tell you,
asking the questions.
I spent more time in Washington talking to politicians for the last 2 to 3 years than I did my whole life up until that point in time. Sometimes I think I'm getting somewhere, and sometimes I think I'm talking to a wall. But the freedoms that we have in this country are not, I mean, they're great, it's wonderful, but there's a negative aspect. We can elect anybody. And people, one voice has a lot to say in Washington. And we've got to try and figure out how to get people not necessarily on the same page, but to understand what the objective is. The objective is, you're right, is to get our kids educated properly. But before you can get them educated properly, you've got to keep the family unit together. The nuclear family in this country has broken apart in many places. And even if a kid's got an internet, what is the mother and the father telling him to do on that internet? Half of them are gone. And maybe the grandmother is raising the kid. So these are issues that we need to face in this country. And it's great that we have open borders, not as far as I'm concerned. We bring in more legal immigrants in this country every year than I think any country in the world. And there's nobody trying to sneak into Russia. There's nobody trying to sneak into China over the border. They want to come here, okay? And then they come here and they criticize this place. I don't get the joke. But the fact is, I think we've got a long way to go, but it starts in D.C., and it starts with our elected officials. And we have got to get those people, and maybe it's term limits, which is a dirty word in D.C., but we've got to get those elected officials to understand what they're there for. Look, I was maybe the biggest supporter of a group for a while called No Labels. And we gave money to politicians who ascribed to the motto, country before party. Sounds great. That's what they're supposed to be doing. But as soon as a bill came up to be voted on, Democrats voted one way, Republicans voted the other way, and I finally got out of that group and stopped supporting them because it's a very frustrating experience. Freedom is something we don't know what to do with sometimes in this country.
Well, then I'll just have to take your message back to Washington then.
I'm trying.
Thank you, everyone.
Everybody here can help, please.
Thank you for joining us for this panel. Thank you.